The aliens' disturbing message. The Anunnaki's return is nearer than you imagine. When the light came down over Dr. James Peterson's backyard, it did not announce itself like a visitor at the door. It settled over the grass like a heatless dawn, thick, golden, bioluminescent, so bright that the stars winked out around its edges. Neighbors would later say they saw a column of light, a humming that vibrated the window panes. Jem would remember it as a feeling first, a low pressure in his skull, a resonance under his feet, like standing on the skin of a giant plucked instrument. He would later repeat words he heard in a language he could not name, not spoken but understood, like a chord struck inside memory. The message, he said, was simple and terrible. The builders are preparing to come back. The machines they left are waking. March of 2026 will not be like any year you've known. This is his testimony. He is not a prophet by trade. He is a man who spent 40 years listening to arterial murmurs and heartbeats, interpreting electrical patterns, diagnosing the thin line between life and death. At 69, retired from a career of white coats and slow elevators, Dr. James Peterson describes himself in that backyard as someone whose whole life had been measured in pulses and routine. He had been, by his own telling, a skeptic, methodical, trained to seek reproducible evidence. Yet the thing that drew him to Egypt was not a paper to be cited or a theory to be proved. It was, he says, an 8-month insistence in the bones. He could not sleep. Images rose at 3 in the morning, rows of pillars, incense smoke in a corridor, a river that was not simply water but an artery. He would find himself opening old atlases and staring until the pages blurred. Medical tests yielded no abnormality, blood pressure steady, EEG unremarkable, scans within expected limits. Margaret, his wife of 44 years, watched him grow inward, the man who once laughed at late-night documentaries, catching himself at the window, eyes glassed with something like reverence. He started crying in front of a travel brochure, she told a friend later, not from sadness, something like recognition. The compulsion culminated in an impulsive ticket, economy class, Cairo. He bought it the day his hands shook so badly he could not hold a pen. When Margaret asked why he needed to go now, he had no better answer than that a place in him was tugging, and that the tug felt like a map turning warm. He left with prescription-strength calmers in his luggage and a single photograph tucked into his coat pocket, a sepia print of the Sphinx he had torn from a magazine years ago and kept folded like a secret. If you find yourself already wanting to click away, to file this account among oddities and personal myth, pause. The witness has a voice that resists easy dismissal. He speaks with the careful cadence of a physician used to withholding judgment until the facts are in. But the facts, he insists on, are not the kind you can enter a lab and measure. He keeps returning, in speech and in the way his hands fold over time, to one word: memory. They woke something in me, he would say, something older than my bones. If this story is drawing at something inside you, whether curiosity, dread, or a stubborn need to know, subscribe and hit the bell to follow this unfolding account. There will be details, many of them strange, and I will return to them patiently as the testimony unfolds. He arrived in Egypt with that photograph and an aching sense of being expected. Cairo tasted of dust and history. The Nile moved like a thread through the city's garment, slow with a current older than empires. Jim spent days in the field, not as a tourist, but like a man following a compass. He visited temples at hours when the tour buses do not arrive, teaching himself the silence of stone, tracing hieroglyphs with fingertips that remembered the grain of carved limestone. He insisted to those who asked that nothing overtly mystical happened at first, only a subtle loosening, as if some seam had been cut and a light came out. The night of the landing was cool. Margaret, back home, had fallen asleep on the couch, Across the ocean, Jim sat on a low wall near a hotel, the city a russet spread behind him. He later told how the world narrowed to the sky. The stars arranged and rearranged like a slow ceiling being rewired. A drone-like hum at first, then shape. A lens of light that slowed against the moon, then descended, not with the thrumming shock of an engine, but with a smoothing of the air itself. It touched down in a courtyard outside the hotel, and the courtyard, Jim said, stopped being a courtyard. Edges softened, shadows rewrote themselves. A figure emerged. He described the being without resorting to cliché. Tall as a doorway, not humanoid in the caricatured sense, but leaning towards a form we might recognize. Dressed in a veiling shimmer like threads of gold and oil. Its skin, if skin is the right word, glowed from within, a translucent bronze tone lit by pulses of light that seemed to follow the rhythm of thought. Where eyes might have been, there were pools of concentrated luminescence that made it difficult to look directly. And yet, when Jim met that gaze, he says, recognition surged through him like a familiar song. He could not hear in conventional terms. The being communicated by what he called a telepathic transmission, a perception of images, emotions, and precise information compressed into feeling. You have been called, the being conveyed, he said. You carried the word. The phrase was not spoken, yet he remembered it as a series of impressions. A river, a child between reeds, a circle of flame. The being did not come as an invader. It introduced itself as an emissary, an envoy sent to activate dormant traces. What we now call the alien in the testimony identified not with our sciences, but with a name that echoes sputtered through myth, Anunnaki, though the entity did not translate the term as ancient human languages had. It offered a claim that the structures on Earth, pyramids, temples, carefully sited monuments, were not mere monuments but instruments. That Egypt had been designed as a global school of initiation, and that the Sphinx in particular had been folded over with an energetic seal to protect the knowledge during a period of withdrawal. Jim's rational mind argued. He told himself, even as the resonance built in his chest, this is impossible. He was a man who read electrograms and prescribed beta blockers. He prided himself on an evidence-based, skeptical approach. Yet, the being's transmission did something else. It opened a corridor in him, and what stepped through was not invention, but memory. The alien placed a small object on a table inside the ship. A crystal, not rough but carved into a perfect polyhedron with facets like small mirrors. Gold filigree encircled its base. When Jim reached out, he felt the almost unbearable warmth of recognition, a hand he had known before. The being communicated the purpose of the object in an image that unfolded like a film. Pyramids whose capstones were crystalline nodes, great halls where harmonic frequencies were played to a congregation like a choir of strings, channels along the Nile tuned as if the river itself were an organ pipe. What followed for Jim was a sequence of visions so vivid he later refused to call them dreams. He spoke of being drawn backward, not by mere imagination, but by the sensation of a timeline unspooling through his spine. He saw ships come from a sky that was more like a lattice than open air. He saw figures stepping down, not as conquerors, but as teachers. They set stones and crystals. They taught people how to attune body and mind to subtle currents. He says they taught with an ethic as much as a technique. Knowledge was given gradually, only as the collective frequency matured. Temples were organized into a system, 42 sites arrayed along the Nile, like stations on a neural path, each with a specialization in human transformation. According to the vision, the pyramids operated as vibrational machines whose functioning depended on geometry, a particular metal mix, and a crystalline interface.
Think of a pyramid, the being conveyed, as you might think of a violin string, stretched over a wooden instrument. Tension, length, and material create a note. The capstone was the bow. The river and the mineral composition around the base were the resonance chamber. Where you strike the string determines the harmonic. In the testimony, the pyramids were tuned to amplify frequencies that recalibrated consciousness, stabilized neuroelectric patterns, and, in trained hands, could be used for healing and initiation.
The Nile, Jim's visions insisted, was not merely a river, but an engineered meridian. Its course had been refined deliberately in ages past, its sediment loaded with colloidal gold and specific mineral ratios that changed the conductivity of the banks. The water carried an instruction, Jim would say repeatedly, not information like words, but a pattern that could teach the body how to hold higher frequencies. In this account, priests and initiates used the river in rites, immersion as a way to step into a different resonance, ritual timing with solstices, temples positioned like tuning forks to the flow. Jim's activated memory, the part of him that remembered a life among those initiates, came alive in the form of scenes that read like cinematic cutaways. A young man kneeling in the hall of Isis, hands laid on a patient whose breathing trembled between spirit and body. The hum of glass-like basins filled with a golden liquid that glinted not as metal but as living light. The sense that healing required precise alignment of breath, intention, and an applied resonance. In one vision, Jim remembered an initiation where a crystal was placed over a forehead and a low, harmonious tone, half song, half geometry, was sustained until the patient's jaw unclenched and tears began to fall. People called it recognition, he described. They didn't always know the words, but their bodies remembered something that said, "You belong here." The temples named in his recollection were familiar mythic centers. Isis for healing and initiation, Thoth for the preservation of knowledge and the harmonics of language, Horus for integration of sight and intention, Hathor for the arts of embodiment, Osiris for death and rebirth mysteries, Anubis for translation beyond the veil. Each temple, the testimony claims, functioned like a module in a larger curriculum. A person would travel in stages, like moving from grade to grade, carrying a readiness metric rather than a diploma. The initiation sequence included practices that altered brainwave states, a softening into theta for mythic repair, a bright focusing into gamma for integration, paired with physical tools, gold-lined chambers, resonant crystals, and structured breathwork. There was, in Jim's telling, a taboo woven into the technology. It worked only when the collective field met a threshold. In the vision, the Anunnaki taught that knowledge left in graspable form had to be protected by what the being called frequency locks. These were not locks in the sense of metal and bolts, but energetic seals keyed to states of consciousness. If the frequency of the environment did not match the unlocking signature, a waveform associated with attunement and ethical readiness, the seal would either refuse to open or react in ways the unprepared could not survive. Jim repeated with the physician's solemnity that the ancient teachers had seen a precedent. He used the word Atlantis to name a catastrophe, a culture that had rushed for power without the corresponding inner work, a chain reaction of technologies and misapplied force that birthed collapse. They learned, Jim said, that knowledge without maturity breaks the vessel. That caution in his testimony explains why some chambers, he would point to the Sphinx in his recounted vision, were not merely hidden but frequency sealed. Records were preserved beneath stone and sound, wrapped in energetic protocols to prevent looting of what could be catastrophic if misused. The Sphinx in the image was less a statue than a sentinel, its face a lock, its paws the guardians of an archive that contained blueprints, not only of machines, but of ways to harmonize the social organism. They protected what they taught, the being conveyed through Jim, for the preservation of life. The vividness of these revelations changed Jim. Where once he had cataloged symptoms and recommended treatments in calm, clinical tones, he now sat with a tremulous smile at the edges of his speech, as though the effort to put these things into language strained against some higher grammar. He returned from Egypt with the air of a man who had stepped through a veil and brought back a handful of seeds. Margaret noticed the change not only in his stories, but in his gait. A kind of gravity lifted off him. Sleep became, paradoxically, heavier and more accepting. Yet the transformation was not simply relief. There was fear braided through his certainty. The alien emissary had not delivered a simple lesson. It had delivered a timetable, a forecast that tasted of urgency. In the ship, as the crystal pulsed and Jim's memories unspooled, the being expanded the scope of the message. According to the transmission, something in the earth had begun to wake the instruments again. Tiny anomalies, electromagnetic whispers, reports of harmonic sounds in certain valleys were the early tremors of a reactivation. The emissary showed aerial patterns like maps of light, where nodes along the Nile grew faintly brighter, and a calendar that highlighted a particular spring month, March of 2026. Jim did not claim certainty in a way that science would recognize. He framed everything as a report from a witness interviewing his own soul. He insisted that he did not know how to translate these inner maps into geopolitical predictions. "I do not know if governments will do X or Y," he told us. "I only know the being sequence." It said 2025 would be a year of preparation, subtle, quiet, easy to miss. The being said the visible, undeniable reactivation would begin in March 2026. He used the same measured tone he had used his entire career. When he spoke of the 2026 window, his hands traced a circle as if enclosing an object precious and dangerous. "We were given a warning," he said. "Whether we hear it is up to us." Interspersed with these cosmic claims were human details that kept the testimony grounded. Jim told of being wakened in the middle of the night after the ship left, drenched in sweat and with the taste of metal at the back of his mouth. He called Margaret, trying to find the right words. She listened, skepticism raveling into concern, into an exhausted tolerance. "If you want to believe," she said quietly, "believe. But if anything sounds like danger, we call someone." Her voice anchored him to domestic reality. Their marriage, he admitted, had seen arguments over evenings in which he turned toward esoterica and she toward routines. Those conflicts did not resolve into melodrama. They became weather, storms that passed, leaving the house rearranged but standing. The alien's transmission, as recounted by Jim, did not merely narrate a coming event. It offered an ethic. The beings, referred to in mythic registers as Anunnaki, were not portrayed as gods descending to save or condemn. They appeared in the testimony as instructors who had once taught, then withdrawn to prevent further catastrophe. Their return, if it came, would be accompanied by selectivity, systems reactivated in a way that the being kept calling safeguarded. The SEAL responses, the emissary indicated, would discriminate not by passport or rank, but by vibrational suitability. Only those who've done the inner alignment will be able to survive within the fields, Jim recalled the being conveying. Others may experience sickness, disorientation, collapse. He described this not as a threat, but as a protocol, an automated system designed to prevent misuse. This is also the point where Jim's story grew more perilous, for it bears implications. The testimony frames possible outcomes with caution. The reactivation would catalyze bifurcation, a pulling apart of societies by their readiness to hold higher frequencies. Jim described two broad pathways, language he and the emissary used as shorthand. One, the path of integration, leads to what the being called a fuller field, a phrase that near the edges of our comprehension sounds like a different density of living. The other, the path of remaining, left people within the structures they had always known, with the risk of being overwhelmed by technologies they could not ethically wield. In the telling, the 7-year span of transition, 2026 to 2033, was a period in which that divergence would sharpen.
There were moments when Jim's physician instincts pierced through mythic cadence. He expressed concern for what the emissary called the neurological collapse risk if unprepared humans entered high-frequency environments. He did not instruct viewers to do anything reckless, no digging under the Sphinx, no attempts to access sealed chambers. He repeated the being's admonition to respect the seals. If you are not ready, he said, don't go where the instruments are. It's not a matter of bravery, it's a matter of biological response.
If, at this point in the testimony, you find yourself wanting reassurance, imagining that a benevolent checklist will save you, you should note that Jim offers no such guarantees. He speaks in probabilities and warnings, not promises. The alien's messages, as he conveys them, are neither a salvation guarantee nor a doomsday prophecy. They are a summons strip mind of comfort, an invitation to inner work that may intersect with an outer event. And yet, the visions of the past were not sterile. They were, in Jim's words, remarkably practical in the way they portrayed technique, breath patterns, specific resonant tones, rhythmic placements of gold and crystal. He described a healing sequence in the Isis Hall where the practitioner would guide a person through an 8-part breath, each phase timed to a low harmonic played on an instrument of metal and water. Contact with the crystal could be intense. The being advised on holding and releasing, not storing power, but translating it into compassionate action. The teachers never wanted to make weapons, Jim said. They wanted to heal the social body. As his memories consolidated, Jim began to recount a catalog of temple specializations, each paired with a function meant to refine some aspect of human capacity. Thoth, in his retelling, housed those who worked with memory and codification, the monks who recorded harmonic signatures and how to keep them safe. Hathor oversaw embodiment and the arts of joy. Workers there taught dance as a way of dissolving neural knots that trap trauma. Horus trained people in sight, not merely eyesight, but perception, how to see the invisible lines that organize social fields. Osiris taught the art of dying and returning, not as an end, but as a transformation in continuity. Anubis served as translator. Its priests were the ones who shepherded between realms so that knowledge could pass without tearing people apart. It is easy to hear these categories and dismiss them as mythic repackaging of universal human archetypes. Jim would not object if you did. He knew how the human mind makes patterns. He also insisted that what he saw included technical specifics, gold-lined chambers that increased conductivity, polarized crystals that acted as transducers, and a geometry that regulated the flow of harmonics. He used simple analogies to help listeners imagine: a pyramid as a violin string, the Nile as a nervous meridian, the capstone as the bow. These metaphors were not meant as fancifulness, but as an accessible way to render otherwise alien functional claims into something listeners could imagine with the body rather than the intellect. The more he learned, the more he felt the tug toward responsibility. One night, after returning from a field trip to a small temple site off the Nile, he told Margaret he had sat in the dark feeling the world as a patient might feel in arrhythmia, invisible, dangerous if ignored. He said he felt like a messenger who had been interrupted mid-speech. We were given a timeline, he told her. Maybe it's literal, maybe it's symbolic. The being said 2025 will be preparation, and then March 2026 will be a turning point. Again, he couched the chronology in testimony. I don't claim to command the sky. I'm reporting what I saw and what was transmitted to me. There is an intimacy to Jim's way of telling, a physician's eye for details that matter, and a soul's confusion at being thrust into myth. He tells of returning to the hotel and finding himself incapable of sleeping, not from restlessness, but because the images would not stop. Vaults of a temple, rows of students humming in a key that made tears come. He says the more he remembered, the more he saw a pattern, an educational system built to awaken capacity safely, and a defense built to prevent premature access. When the emissary left him that night, it did so not with a threat, but with an instruction that sounded like both blessing and admonition. Ready the heart, do not force what is sealed. The ship, the golden crystal, the emissary's eyes, these images refuse easy categorization. Jim's voice when he recounts them tightens in ways an interviewer can feel. He uses the words disturbing message often, and the term contains a double meaning, disturbed as in unsettled, and disturbed as in intentionally altered the quiet assumptions of his life. If you imagine a man who traded a lifetime of objective measures for an inner map that cannot be readily validated, you would not be wrong. He knows that admitting such things in a world that prizes empirical verification invites ridicule. He also believes, with a steadiness he rarely shows, that living in the pretense of normalcy is a different kind of danger. At the edge of where his past life memories meet the present, the emissary did something that shifted the tenor of the message. It gave a calendar. It did so, the testimony reports, without fuss, more like a physician noting a marker than a prophet announcing doom. 2025, the being conveyed in a compressed series of images, faint lights along riverbanks, people pausing and feeling their chest as if checking a pulse. A year of preparation. It showed small events that might be dismissed as anomalies, an unusual bird migration, mysterious harmonic recordings on certain geophones, an uptick in reports of theme park-like phenomena that lacked conventional explanation. The being's tone was neither triumphant nor sinister. It was administrative. The world had a system, and in its system a scheduled re-engagement was imminent. When Jim told this part of the story, he smiled and then grew silent for a long beat, as though weighing whether to offer more. He did not need to. The implication hung in the air like a note sustained on a cello. For a man trained to measure time by heartbeats and to determine intervention by thresholds, this claim came with a kind of clarity that terrified him. An experience of urgency grounded not in sensationalism, but in duty. If this assembly is real, he said finally, then we have months to prepare. If it's not, then we are no worse for being kinder, more attentive, more practiced in inner discipline. He used the words if and according to the transmission more than once, careful to avoid asserting cosmic truths as settled facts. We arrive here at a crossroads in his testimony, where what he remembers from ancient halls begins to overlap with the emissary's timetable, where memory and forecast brush against each other. He describes in increasing detail the mechanics of temple work, the sequence of initiations, the way a group was trained to hold a harmonic so that the instrument of a pyramid could be used without trauma. He speaks of the ethical code the Anunnaki allegedly taught, that power withheld by immaturity would do more harm than good, and that the earth itself deserves stewardship rather than extraction. The picture is at once comfortingly pedagogical and relentlessly demanding. It is also, by Jim's account, just the beginning. The emissary's final image before leaving him on his hotel balcony was a diagram of time, a circle with segments highlighted, a soft pulsing over the node labeled March 2026, and the words, translated into sensation, that this would be an opening. He sensed the word like a door sliding, not a parade. That's when it becomes visible, he said. That's when those who can see will see. That's when the instruments may chime back to life. He did not claim he knew how the visible would manifest, lights, sounds, mass sightings. He only reported the transmission. He has, since returning from Egypt and recounting these scenes multiple times to different audiences, tried to make sense of the demand the message placed on him. He is not, he says, trying to profit from the story. He has refused offers that treated his account as a performance.
He continues to live quietly with Margaret, both of them adjusting to the surreal commodity of ordinary days interrupted by the knowledge of a possibility that could change the field of human experience. He attends church sometimes, more out of habit than doctrine. He has begun, out of curiosity and caution, to practice very modest meditative disciplines, simple breath practices, not esoteric instruction, because the emissary emphasized inner alignment. Before we leave this segment of the testimony, two notes of caution that the witness himself emphasized. First, the transmission framed the Anunnaki not as invaders, but as teachers who withdraw when misuse threatens life. Second, the emissary repeatedly cautioned, not as a threat but as a practical warning, that those who are unprepared and attempt to access sealed chambers could suffer neurological harm.
Jim, precise and cautious as ever, insisted he would not prescribe actions to others. He would only tell what he had been told and what he had lived. It is at this point, his return from Egypt, the early consolidation of memory, the emissary's calendar, that the testimony begins to shift from excavation of the past to a forecast of near-future events. The world, as he sees it, tightens into a narrow window. A year of preparation, an opening in March of 2026, and a transitional period stretching to 2033. What the emissary called selection, the practice of frequency-based inclusion and protection, is complex and fraught. When he first recounted the idea, listeners asked about fairness, access, and the ethics of a system that appears to protect some while excluding others. Jim, troubled, invoked the story of Atlantis as a precedent, a civilization that had rushed for technological mastery without corresponding maturation. They had no ethical scaffold, he said, and so it ended in ruins. The emissary's posture in his memory was one of steady regret rather than triumphalism, focused on avoiding repetition. The seals, the being insisted, were not meant to exclude forever, but to triage, a painful yet necessary triage to ensure that certain lines of knowledge would be offered only in proportion to the capacity to steward them. He paused in his telling, folding himself inward as if to gather an inner resource. The return, he said slowly, is nearer than you imagine. He had already used the same words in the ship, as if the emissary had taught him to speak in half parables. The sentence feels like a bell toll, an alarm and an invitation entangled. The testimony hangs now on the edge of the emissary's next disclosure, which, according to Jim, would connect ancient systems to an explicit modern timetable and practical applications for anyone who feels called to prepare. It is here that the narrative must pause, not because the story lacks momentum, but because the urgency of the next phase demands clarity and space. What follows in Jim's account will take us deeper into the mechanics of reactivation, the specific functions of the 42 temples, and a more explicit description of the selection process and its consequences. There will be voices of friends and skeptics, more personal reckonings between Jim and Margaret, and the unfolding of how small anomalies in 2025 begin to coalesce into a pattern that hums with intent. For now, the light that touched the earth has gone. The image of the emissary's eyes lingers. The crystal's facets have been tucked into memory like a map folded in a wallet. Jim walks the days with both dread and devotion. He says, more and more, that the question posed by the visions is less about extraterrestrial timelines than about the readiness of hearts, a preparation that, whether the Anunnaki come exactly as foretold, or whether the message functions as an archetypal awakening, has consequences for how we live with one another in the months to come. The next transmissions, Jim told us in a voice that held both scientist and seer, would lay bare the specific sequence the emissary claimed. 2025 as preparation, March 2026 as the point of visible reactivation, and the 7-year interval through 2033 as a time of selection, training, and transit. But before we move into that part of the account, we need to hear more from him about what he remembers of the temple curriculum, how he experienced initiation as someone who had once been within the halls of Isis, and what the emissary explained about the geometry and materials that made the pyramids function as instruments rather than monuments. He closed our last conversation by repeating a phrase that had settled in his chest like a pulse. If the doors open, what will you bring through them? It is a question aimed as much at private interior life as at collective destiny. He said, finally, that the being's message was not delivered as prophecy alone, but as a test. A disturbing message, yes, and a nearer one than most imagine. Jim's last words hung in the air between us like a held breath. If the doors open, what will you bring through them? He spoke them as both a warning and a summons, exactly the tone the emissary had impressed upon him on that hotel balcony. What followed in his telling was less a neat sequence of events and more a widening of perspective. How the ancient curriculum might translate into modern practice. How preparation would feel in the body. How small anomalies in 2025 could collect into a pattern that announces a larger turning. He began, in the weeks after his return, to unpack what the emissary had shown him about the inner mechanics of the temples, and he did so with the same careful cadence of a physician translating scans for a worried patient. The temple curriculum, Jim said, read like a training of the nervous system as much as of the mind. It was staged by purpose. First, stabilization, teaching the body to dwell in a broader range of vibratory states without panic. Second, attunement, refining perception so that subtle signatures could be read without distortion. Third, integration, learning to bring the altered expanded states back into daily life so that they did not become escape. These stages were enacted with a mixture of material technology and disciplined practice. Jim described exercises that, in his memory, combined breath, tone, and contact with tuned crystals. None of these were, he insisted, magical shortcuts. They were, in the vision, educational scaffolds to enlarge capacity slowly and ethically. He began, in the weeks after his return, to unpack what the emissary had shown him about the inner mechanics of the temples, and he did so with the same careful cadence of a physician translating scans for a worried patient. The temple curriculum, Jim said, read like a training of the nervous system as much as of the mind. It was staged by purpose. First, stabilization, teaching the body to dwell in a broader range of vibratory states without panic. Second, attunement, refining perception so that subtle signatures could be read without distortion. Third, integration, learning to bring the altered, expanded states back into daily life so that they did not become escape. These stages were enacted with a mixture of material technology and disciplined practice. Jim described exercises that, in his memory, combined breath, tone, and contact with tuned crystals. None of these were, he insisted, magical shortcuts. They were, in the vision, educational scaffolds to enlarge capacity slowly and ethically. He spoke of a typical initiation in the Isis Hall as if describing a clinical protocol. First, the candidate was cleared by a circle of elders who measured not only psychological readiness but social intention. Their relationships, their record of harm or healing, their ability to bear responsibility. Those who passed were given a sequence of breath practices, an opening series to lower adrenal arousal, a middle series that used soft nasal rhythms to shift into theta-like states, and a closing series that emphasized grounding and restitution to the community. During the middle phase, a low, sustained harmonic would be produced by a water metal instrument. Jim called it an organ of metal, and a polished crystal would be placed at the crown. The crystal, according to the transmission, acted as a transducer. It converted subtle electromagnetic shifts into bodily cues that the nervous system could read. The experience, Jim said, was like tuning a string instrument. When a person aligned, their whole physiology responded in synchrony.
When they were not aligned, the instruments either refused to take hold or produced uncomfortable reactions intended to deter misuse. These accounts could read as technobabble if offered without the texture Jim provided. The smell of warmed metal in a vaulted hall, the dampness of Nile air in the temples near the river, the way light pooled in gold-lined niches like slow honey. He emphasized the sensorial because, he said, the curriculum itself was embodied knowledge. In one memory he described, a child, no more than 9, sat cross-legged in a chamber and began to hum in a key that settled other crying children. "They call it recognition," he repeated. "Bodies remember first, mind follows." Jim's recollection of the 42 temple system gave those numbers shape and purpose. Far from being a tidy tour itinerary, the temples formed a nested pedagogy. Some sites were entry points, small riverside sanctuaries where novices learned to tolerate subtle currents. Others were advanced laboratories, chambers where crystalline capstones amplified harmonics sufficiently to modulate brain patterns in trained individuals. A few were repositories, like Thoth's houses, where records were preserved in folded frequencies. Jim's imagery made the system feel like a nervous network for a planet. The Nile acted as a spinal column, temples as vertebrae, the Sphinx as a gate at the base of the skull. The poetic quality of the metaphors did not, in his telling, undercut their supposed functional claims. If anything, they made them more comprehensible to a listener who had spent a lifetime translating one kind of pattern, physiological, into another. Those who had once been part of this system, the emissary explained through images, were trained to steward information with an ethic. Jim remembered the Anunnaki teaching the value of triage, that not all openings should be allowed at once, that the arc of maturation required time. He connected this to the Atlantis story not in a moralizing way, but as a clinical case study. A civilization took knowledge before it had the social structures to hold it, and the results were catastrophic. The transmissive tone of the emissary struck him. "We are teachers, not conquerors. We learn from what has been broken," it conveyed. An intimacy that made the message feel less like prophecy and more like the report of a teacher remembering a failed semester. Back in his small domestic life with Margaret, Jim began to feel the pressure of public scrutiny. Word had spread through small networks, friends in the esoteric community, listeners at a local church who were more curious than judgmental. A handful of people reached out privately. A retired engineer who claimed a similar resonant experience on a night in the desert, a woman who said she had dream visions of a crystalline capstone and woke with the smell of iodine, an artist who mailed a sketch of a pyramid cross-section she had drawn after hearing him speak. To Jim, these correspondences felt like small confirmations of resonance rather than proof. Margaret watched the stream of contacts like a slow faucet. Her skepticism never vanished, but her worry deepened into attentiveness. "Don't sign anything," she joked at one point, an attempt at lightness. But the joke carried a tether to the seriousness she felt. As 2025 progressed, the emissary's preparation phase, Jim and a loosely connected group of curious listeners began to catalog anomalies. He insisted on calling them anomalies rather than evidence. The list, he said, was small and often the kind of data that mainstream channels could easily dismiss. Audio recordings of harmonic tones captured in rural valleys, a series of geophone readings showing faint patterned pulses in a narrow band, birds deviating from expected migrations, unusual auroral displays outside typical latitudes, news stories of fishermen speaking of changes in the Nile's taste. Most of these items were local, sporadic, and ambiguous. Some were debunked. A few remained unexplained. The emissary had described such subtleties as the kind of early tremor you could only see if you were already looking for it. Jim also described subtle physiological signals he began to notice in other people who spent time with him. Instances of prolonged calm after certain shared meditations, sudden emotional recognition between strangers after a ritual song, brief lucid dreams in people who had never reported visions before. He did not claim causation. He framed these as interesting correlations that suggested the possibility of a field shifting incrementally. To his trained ear, this was a pattern worth noting. Small perturbations in many systems converging on an emergent event. He encouraged caution in interpretation. "We don't need mass hysteria," he told a small group on a late-night call. "We need clear eyes and steady hearts."
The stakes of clear eyes became painfully personal when he described the emissary's warnings about unprepared entry into sealed fields. The descriptions were clinical and chilling in equal measure. Displacement of ionic gradients in brain tissue, acute mismatches between automatic states and environmental fields, convulsive disorientation that, in extreme cases, could lead to irreversible neurological episodes. He described witnessing, through vision, the aftermath of such transgressions. Corridors filled with people who had forced entry, bodies collapsed, instruments humming in a frequency that was not accepted. The storytellers he respected in his community, the older initiates who had trained with practices akin to the temple work, read these passages with sober faces. They urged restraint and strict adherence to ethical principles. Jim repeated the caution as if it were a prescription: do no harm, and when in doubt, step away. Politics and rumor rushed in like a swell. Some fringe outlets spun his account into conspiratorial headlines. Others lampooned it. A local journalist asked bluntly whether he expected governments to do anything. Jim's reply, faithful to every careful phrase he had used, held to the limits of his knowledge. "I do not know," he said. The transmission did suggest that human institutions might respond in predictable ways. Some would study, some would deny, some would seek to control. That, however, was the projection of human habit, not an instruction from the emissary. He resisted speculation on that front because it threatened to turn his account into a political Rorschach. Still, the cultural reaction had real effects. Margaret found herself receiving odd messages. An invitation from a man who claimed to represent a private research group. A polite but insistent request to publish Jim's account as a commercialized narrative. An offer from a small publisher to collate his testimony into a glossy book. He refused most offers out of a simple desire for privacy and an ethical discomfort with monetizing a message he had not chosen to send. He accepted, however, one practical suggestion: to keep a simple log of anomalies and to urge people to focus on inner preparation rather than fieldwork. "If there is a reactivation," he told listeners in a private meeting, "we will be judged less by what we possess than by what we have become." As spring 2026 approached, the tension built in a way that he felt physically. The months of 2025 had, in the view of the emissary, been a calibration. Reports intensified, not in the dramatic sense the tabloids craved, but as an increase in small, shareable oddities. A quiet cluster of sensor anomalies in regions historically connected to ancient sites. A handful of fishermen reporting pearls of colloidal-type sediment in the river when they had never seen such things. Elders in villages speaking of renewed dreams. The emissary's language, transmitted telepathically, had not detailed the parade of visible signs. Rather, it used metaphors that perhaps made the most sense to someone trained in physiology. A doorbell sounded in the body's periphery, it conveyed. Jim translated the image for those around him as a call to greater inner discipline. More regular meditation, community tending, and an ethical commitment to reduce harm. March 2026, then, arrived as the emissary had indicated, charged with expectation and ambiguous enough that people could still choose multiple meanings. In Jim's telling, the first visible sign was not a single event, but a mosaic. Some communities reported a hush in the air, a soft lowering of sound, as if the world had taken a breath.
In remote places, instruments recorded a transient spike of harmonics across frequencies that had been quiet for decades. Countries that had long histories of archaeological tension reported unusual radar blips over areas with little human traffic. It was the kind of pattern that invites both credulous leaps and cautious dismissal. What made it different was how many independent observers reported similar structural characteristics. Tones aligning with geometric patterns, lights that pulsed in symmetries consistent with certain sacred proportions. Then came the openings. Jim's account of what happened next reads like a slow montage of sensory events. In the hours that followed the recorded anomalies, certain monuments, not only in Egypt but in other places, appeared to ring in ways witnesses had never noticed. Tourists stationed at distance reported hearing harmonic overtones that made their teeth ache pleasantly, the kind of vibration you feel under your skin but cannot point to. In one such account, a local guard near a temple, unnamed in Jim's retelling for safety, described a rise in ambient pitch and a soft flicker in a capstone that had long been covered in grime. He told how people clustered and some wept, others laughed with a kind of hysterical joy. Where the pyramids had been mute stones for centuries, some observers claimed a sense of movement. Not physical displacement, but a sense that the stones had re-established an electromagnetic conversation with their surroundings. The Sphinx, if you accept Jim's retelling as testimony rather than empirically proven fact, played a central role. Witnesses, again mostly local and often unnamed in his narrative for their protection, spoke of a low, consistent hum under the pause, a pressure in the chest, a sensation of being scanned like a passport. Jim cautioned listeners that these reports were fragmentary and described as he had been told, not necessarily as he had independently verified. Still, the image congealed. The Sphinx not as a passive monument, but as a keyed sentinel, responding to something that matched its ancient signature. We must be cautious here. Jim was explicit in stating that no one should attempt to breach or excavate sealed sites.
His retelling repeated as a litany the emissary's admonition that seals were not to be physically forced. In the instances he recounted where a small group attempted to access a sealed chamber, driven by curiosity or profit, they described immediate physiological distress, vertigo, overwhelming nausea, transient paralysis in limbs, and, in 2 reported cases, longer-term neurological damage. These accounts appeared in small forums and were amplified in closed community groups. Jim used these stories as moral examples. The seals were not traps to be overcome, but protective systems designed to triage human readiness. He spoke of them with the gravitas of a clinician pronouncing caution. For those who had done inner work, however, those who had cultivated steady breath, ethical conduct, and communal accountability, the reactivation felt different. Jim told of a few people he knew personally who experienced a kind of acceptance rather than collapse. These individuals described a smooth, warm alignment in their chest and a sense of being received rather than invaded. They reported visceral recognition as if being welcomed home. One woman in her 50s who had quietly practiced a simple daily discipline for months sent Jim a message. "I was not swept away. I felt like I matched a door frame." He read the message aloud once, and there was a hush. For him, this was the moral of the emissary's message. Inner practice does not guarantee bliss, but it may change the quality of encounter. The visible returns in March 2026 also produced social consequences. Markets and governments shifted in small but meaningful ways. Some media outlets amplified sensational narratives, prompting tourists and curiosity seekers to the edges of sacred sites, which in turn produced clashes with local authorities and archaeologists. Jim deplored the spectacle. Margaret worried at its practical consequences. Community leaders in affected areas asked for restraint. International heritage organizations urged protection. Jim's voice in the public sphere became one of ethical caution and inner work rather than spectacle seeking.
If you care at all for these places or for people, he would say, then hold your curiosity with tenderness. The emissaries claimed that the reactivation would be discriminatory in the frequency sense seemed to manifest in Jim's account as a kind of socio-physical bifurcation. Some communities reported a rapid flourishing of cooperative practices. People shared resources, community gardens, and mutual aid networks that seemed to mirror the Anunnaki's ethic of stewardship rather than extraction. Other places fractured. Where greed or fear dominated, social systems frayed. People became susceptible to manipulation and quick opportunism. Jim used the metaphor of the river's current. In some tributaries, sediment settled. In others, it erupted in mudslides. The emissaries claimed that the reactivation would be discriminatory in the frequency sense seemed to manifest in Jim's account as a kind of socio-physical bifurcation. Some communities reported a rapid flourishing of cooperative practices. People shared resources, community gardens, and mutual aid networks that seemed to mirror the Anunnaki's ethic of stewardship rather than extraction. Other places fractured. Where greed or fear dominated, social systems frayed. People became susceptible to manipulation and quick opportunism. Jim used the metaphor of the river's current. In some tributaries, sediment settled. In others, it erupted in mudslides.
The period that followed, into the stretch through 2026 and beyond into the transition toward 2033, was one of intensifying divergence. Training structures emerged, according to Jim's reports. The emissary had framed the Anunnaki's re-engagement as a partnership conditional on demonstrated maturity. Those who had held to disciplined practices found themselves called by local, often informal circles to steward group practices. Simple harmonic meditations, secured transmissions of tone, and coordinated care for returning or destabilized neighbors. In several accounts Jim encountered, these groups acted not as secretive cults, but as neighborhood-based support systems that modeled the Anunnaki's ethical scaffolding. Slow transmission, accountability, and an emphasis on restitution rather than acquisition. The emissaries estimate that the transition would last from 2026 to 2033 to be a 7-year span in which reactivation and adjustment unfolded, hung over Jim as he walked the next months. During that time, according to his testimony, the training would intensify in some places, becoming organized workshops that taught people how to hold altered states alongside ordinary life, how to care for children in an environment in which resonant anomalies sometimes jolted the autonomic system, how to keep food supply stable, how to maintain governance without succumbing to fear. In other places, the lack of preparation exacerbated stress, leading to desperation and social breakdown. Jim's narratives about these years are full of small human dramas. A village elder who organized nightly watch circles to sing low harmonics that comforted animals and people alike. A family who held their home steady when neighbors reported collapse. A young teacher who opened up her classroom to discuss ethical stewardship with teenagers. Throughout this period, Jim's relationship with Margaret deepened in unexpected ways. Where suspicion had once undercut conversation, a shared sense of responsibility knitted them together into a small, private fellowship. Margaret, who had initially called him incredulous and half-worried, became his first interlocutor, his sounding board, and the person who kept him tethered to ordinary life. She insisted, gently but firmly, that his work include practical safeguards, medical checks, trusted contact lists, and a refusal to engage with media that sought to monetize shock. "This isn't about spectacle," she told him one evening as they sat with a pot of tea. "It's about being useful to people. Don't be another rumor." He took that counsel to heart. It shaped the way he framed the testimony in public, less as a rallying cry, more as a medical caution and moral appeal. By the time the larger cultural effects settled into a new rhythm, Jim had become a small node in a broader network of individuals who shared similar experiences. They did not all agree on interpretation. Some were convinced the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrials returning. Others read the emissary's message as an archetypal reawakening that functioned whether or not physical ships traversed space. Jim allowed for both possibilities, anchoring his claims in the phrase he had repeated since the first encounter, according to the transmission. This phrase both guarded against absolutism and acknowledged the peculiar authority the emissary had held in his interior life. The ethical core of his message grew more pronounced in public forums. He emphasized stewardship, that advanced knowledge is not an end in itself, but a means to heal and to serve. He spoke against the commodification of sacred practices and cautioned against extractive impulses. If the Anunnaki return, or whatever force this pattern represents, they will not be your vendors, he told a small gathering. They will be teachers and tests. He urged those who felt an inner call to prepare in the ways the emissary described, to do so within community structures, under elders, and with clear commitments to reduce harm. He reiterated again and again the explicit admonition from the transmission: do not attempt illegal or dangerous entry into sealed sites. Don't be heroic, he told novice seekers, be honest. As the 7-year transition moved along, accounts continued to flood in, some mediated by technology, some only whispered in kitchens. There were impressive stories of healing reported by small communities who had sustained the inner work, people who had been chronically ill experiencing changes in quality of life, individuals finding resolution of long-standing addiction patterns embedded in community support, entire neighborhoods reporting more stability in children. Jim presented these as possible correlations rather than guaranteed causal relationships. He insisted that responsible people keep their feet on the ground. For every report of uplift, there remained stories of harm where people rushed, misapplied the technology, or allowed zeal to eclipse compassion. One of the more troubling phenomena Jim recorded in his logs was the rise of opportunism, people who claimed exclusive access to initiation protocols in return for money or loyalty. He used these cases to teach a moral: spiritual maturity cannot be bought in transactional arrangements. The emissary's ethics, as conveyed through Jim, require transparency, accountability, and a measured release of knowledge in proportion to demonstrated service. They would not hand a sword to a child, he said quietly. The arc of Jim's own life continued to bend under the strain and beauty of these developments. Physically, he aged as all humans do, his hair thinner, his step more considered. Psychologically, however, something in him had rearranged so that ordinary moments took on a sacramental weight. Margaret's hand across his knee, the smell of rain on hot earth, the way sunlight struck the corner of his living room table. The emissary's presence, though no longer physically manifest, lived in his muscle memory. He had not become a zealot. He remained, in many ways, a careful clinician who measured his enthusiasms and held them to ethical scrutiny. He kept to small meditative practices, light, regular, communal when possible, and offered his testimony as a nudge rather than a command. As 2033 approached, the world had not split neatly into a utopian paradisical division and a dystopian remainder. Instead, the transition produced a complex tapestry. Some communities flourished in richer, more connected modes of being. Some regions experienced instability that required outside assistance. And many people found their lives rearranged by small but meaningful changes in how societies prioritized the common good. The emissary's prediction of bifurcation, as recounted by Jim, was not a clean binary, but a divergence in tendencies across networks of people. In places where humility, stewardship, and relational repair were practiced, the re-engagement of ancient systems, whether technology or metaphor, was less likely to shred the social fabric. Toward the end of his spoken recollections, Jim often returned to a practical, gentle set of recommendations he framed as safe, ethical approaches to inner work. He called it the inner Egypt, a phrase that both honored the geography of the vision and the interior architecture it mirrored.
The inner Egypt, he explained, is the set of practices anyone can do anywhere to stabilize and enlarge capacity without violating the emissary's admonitions. These practices, he presented modestly, included steady breathwork that calms sympathetic overdrive, simple community-based caring practices that test a person's willingness to serve rather than to extract, and a commitment to truth-telling, a refusal to allow fear or greed to anonymize one's ethics. He warned, however, that these were not hacks for sudden transcendence. They are small seeds, he said, and the work of growing them is daily and social. He taught a specific daily habit he called tuning the field, a 5 to 10 minute practice done in small groups that combined simple breath, a low hum, and an intentional act of restitution, pledging to oneself and one other person to act in kindness that day. Jim framed it as a way to build communal readiness without promising any cosmological guarantees. If anything comes, he said, the first requirement will be that you do no harm and that you are reliable. He also continued to insist on one other litany: do not attempt to access sealed chambers. He repeated the emissary's warning about neurological collapse as a moral and medical caution, not as a threat. If curiosity burned, he advised study, respectful pilgrimage to legal supported cultural sites, and an investment in community resilience. He told viewers and listeners to prioritize children's safety, public health, and cooperative systems that reduce harm. He told viewers and listeners to prioritize children's safety, public health, and cooperative systems that reduce harm.
The emissary's ethic, as translated through him, was less about reaching a higher state than about introducing a higher standard of compassion into ordinary life. As he matured in public endorsement, Jim became increasingly weary of spectacle and increasingly devoted to small, practical outcomes. He helped organize tiny neighborhood circles that practiced the inner Egypt disciplines and offered mutual aid to neighbors. He and Margaret hosted a community soup night once a week, an ordinary, beautiful practice that grounded their lives in reciprocity. He said these small acts were, in their own way, as meaningful as the grander visions. In the end, the most haunting thing about the emissary's message, what made it truly disturbing, as Jim would not hesitate to call it, was not the possibility of metallic ships or reactivated stones. It was the quiet moral sting contained in the question, if the doors open, what will you bring through them? The disturbance lies in the demand for ethical readiness, to be the kind of people who would use knowledge to heal rather than to harm, to hold power with humility instead of sovereignty, to let the world become a classroom for moral capacity rather than a quarry for exploitation. He closed many of his talks with a practical, plain-spoken invitation that echoed the emissary's administrative tone. Prepare internally, build community, be kind, and keep your feet on the ground. He urged people to learn skills that benefit neighbors, basic first aid, conflict mediation, food preservation, and to practice regular, modest meditative disciplines that cultivate steadier hearts. He framed these as pragmatic resilience, not as charters for passage to any promised realm. Preparation is not a passport, he would say. It is a condition. It is how we become trustworthy. Some listeners responded with skepticism, others with gratitude. A few accused him of stoking fear or of monetizing mystical claims. He accepted critique as inevitable, and often it helped him refine his message. When he was tempted by offers to monetize the story, Margaret's steady hand and his own professional ethics restrained him. He permitted a single practical project, a small ebook and resource packet that compiled the responsible practices he had learned, breath practices, community organization checklists, and ethical frameworks. Not to sell salvation, but to circulate practical guidance. He made the resource low-cost and transparent in purpose, to encourage inner and communal readiness without promising miracles.
He offered private consultations too, but limited them to conversations on ethical stewardship and community health rather than esoteric initiation. These choices reflected his desire to honor the emissary's message without exploiting it.
Years later, when the narrative of March 2026 was recounted in magazines and on quiet radio shows, the headline that stuck in some circles echoed the phrase he had used so often. The aliens' disturbing message, the Anunnaki's return, is nearer than you imagine. The title, at once alluring and alarming, captured the dual tenor of his testimony: disturbance and nearness, alarm and invitation. But if you listened to Jim at length, you heard less about spectacle and more about steady work. How to cultivate a life that could meet any threshold with integrity. In private, Margaret sometimes said she wished the world would treat their story with less heat. "This is about living well," she told him once, "not about proving anything." Jim agreed. He had not become a doomsayer. He had become someone who heard an uncanny summons and tried, as any good clinician might, to translate it into practical directives aimed at reducing harm and increasing capacity. If you come away from Jim's account with a single clear sense, it is this: the emissary's message functioned as a mirror, refracting the choice before any listener. The return, whether literal, symbolic, or both, forced a question upon human conduct. Will we steward knowledge with compassion, or will we use it as an instrument of division? Will we answer the call with humility or with hunger? The emissary, through Jim's recollection, did not pronounce ultimate judgment. It placed responsibility in human hands. So where does that leave you, the listener, in the present? Jim's answer remained resolutely practical and morally simple. If you feel a pull, curiosity, call, or dread, start with the small, non-spectacular disciplines he recommended. Strengthen your relationships, practice steady breath, cultivate community reciprocity, and refuse to be drawn into exploitative schemes that promise quick ascension. If you want more structured guidance, there is a concise resource that gathers safe preparatory practices and ethical guidelines. A small ebook and consultation options Jim helped produce to keep the conversation grounded. It is not an arcane manual or a triumphant key. It is, in his words, a folder of practical first aid for the soul. As he liked to say when people asked whether the Anunnaki or the emissary were to be feared, fear is not the point, responsibility is. The disturbance the message creates is, in that sense, a moral sharpening. It insists that readiness is not an achievement, but a discipline. The last image Jim left with me, the one that refuses to settle because it is both beautiful and uncanny, was of the Sphinx's cheek catching a single shaft of sunlight, as if it were a lens focusing a beam across centuries. He said the emissary's parting impression had been of instruments waiting, not for worship, but for stewardship. He said, we could misuse them, we could also learn. He folded his hands and smiled with a tired compassion that matched the long arc of his life. "If the door's open," he repeated, softer now, "the real question is who we have become by then." If you feel a pull to explore this further, if the question jars something in your chest, there are two ways to continue responsibly. First, engage with your local community in small acts of mutual aid and steady practice. Second, if you want curated guidance based on Jim's testimony, practical inner disciplines, community-building checklists, and ethical frameworks, I helped assemble a modest ebook and schedule limited consultations for those seeking responsible stewardship, link in the description. These resources are offered with one promise: no guarantees, only practices tested in small communities and rooted in ethics. If you choose to explore them, bring humility and a willingness to serve. The emissary's message remains, for Jim and for many who witnessed the events and their aftermath, both disturbing and near. It is disturbing because it asks difficult moral questions. It is near because the choice it asks of us, how to steward knowledge, how to care for one another, lies within reach now in ordinary actions. Whatever your interpretation of the events, literal return, archetypal awakening, or both, the story's final demand is unmistakable. Readiness is an ethical project, not a spectral guarantee. So I leave you with the question Jim has been repeating for years, the bell he sounded the night the light came down. If the doors open, what will you bring through them? Will you bring humility, care, and service? Or will you bring hunger and haste? The answer, as he insisted, matters more than any piece of cosmic hardware. If this account has moved you, consider sharing it with someone who will treat it with the seriousness Jim tried to bring to it. If you feel called to responsible preparation, the ebook and consultation link in the description provide practical, ethically framed ways to begin. And whether or not the Anunnaki return in the manner the emissary described, the moral work this story sets before us remains urgent, nearer than you might imagine. Will you answer when the call comes?